survey questionnaires are expensive if you go house by house, but you can use social network. You can use, you know, happiness index at the end of each government service transaction and collect a lot of data. So if within the survey a certain standard for how to measure user satisfaction or how to measure different types of interoperability, countries can add those standard questions into their local instruments and work with the National Institute of Statistics to align the instruments, because that's the only way that you can have comparable data among countries. And what we did in Red Real, which is the Latin American network and the Caribbean region, is to have a measurement group that decide on key indicators that were common to the 32 Latin American countries and agree to work as a team and develop the capacity to collect the data. Another suggestion for data availability is the time frame. So usually the survey makes a cut, which is, for example, 2016 for the 2018 edition. But technology moves faster. So for example, we're increasing connectivity coverage by 10 million a year. So if we don't capture that increase by the time the survey is published, then it may seem that the country is behind. So I think by having the toolkit that you mentioned with the ability for countries to plug in updated data on the KPIs that there is availability, assessment can be updated very frequently. And I think that will add a lot of value to policymakers. And I totally agree with what Felicity shared about measuring openness and collaborative and the common, creative common licensing, definitely.
Great, so Felicity, and then before you start Felicity, then we're going to go to Gianluca, and then we're going to just end with both Elsa and Morten speaking to question 5. So you want to speak to question 5, Elsa? Yeah. Morten, sorry, oh, do you?
No.
No, you're, okay. So Felicity, Vincenzo, and then we'll move to question 5 with Elsa. Oh, and Yolanda. So 2 people to speak on question 5.
Yeah, so that was just a response to your measuring. Was the idea is essentially the OECD, the UN University creates a series of URIs to pages for the governments themselves to provide the data in whatever plugins, whether they be putting the information in themselves or whether they be using real-time information through APIs, and that sort of allows you to set time periods where you can just scrape the data from those indexes and then look at the gaps and start to use the time that you have left over to try and fill them in by the laborious process of interacting individually.
Great. Okay. So Vincenzo,
yeah.
and then Elsa and Yolanda on question 5.
Just I want to add some information for all of you, because it's relative to what we discussed, because when we say data collection also we need to go back to identify which are the indicators. And about that, I want to recall all of you that we are co-leading a task group on ICT for SDGs with ITU. This group is still open. It's a multi-stakeholder task force that work to identify ICT indicators that will complement the baseline of the SDGs. And this is the only official body that will produce a report that will submit to the Statistics Commission, that is the only one that can then really certify, if they agree and they approve, which are the official indicators that will be complement that one. We need to, the deadline that we have is 2020, but we need to produce this draft document before the end of the year. Still, there is time for all of you. When I say all of you, can participate as a country, as an organization, even as individual. What is important is that really we make as much as possible inclusive, and we collect as much as possible inputs from you. And it's not very complicated. We work online, we exchange mail, but that is the only official body that will present officially a proposal of additional indicator on ICT for development that will complement the other that are already approved and so far. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Elsa, you've got the mic. Great.
Yes.
So we have 7 minutes if we have to get out of here on time. So go ahead, I don't think we have to get out here exactly on time.
For me, it really makes sense to keep it, the instrument. I think it was extremely influential for governments, and I think it was a tool for enabling governments to make decisions about investments in digital government. Yes, so I think this was the most positive outcomes of the instrument. But I don't think it is an or there. I think it is an and. So I believe that the instrument could be strengthened through other type of tools, yes? And I believe, based on what we were discussing here, that, for instance, creating regional committees, regional working groups that could help in assessing, or for instance, collecting data, in assessing the quality of data, in providing inputs, in brainstorming, I don't know, in collaboratively joint efforts in strengthening how the e-government survey is produced and how it is used. These are most positive tools that we can have.
Great, thank you. Yolanda?
Yeah, I would totally say that it's a very important instrument. In the case of Mexico, the UN Government Survey is the only indicator that we have with the International Development Plan, which is the framework for executing all government policies, as an objective indicator. So I know it can always be better, of course, like everything, but it's an important reference for government policy making. And I would also add that technology comes to help. So having toolkits with self-assessment questionnaires or guidelines. So this is the type of data that you should be producing in order to have this output. I think that's extremely relevant. And also not just to publish the survey, but to promote discussion within countries. So that is the best way to comply with the trends. And also exemplar normative framework. I know this survey asks for, you have a digital signature, you have a digital identity law and all that, but I think something that has been useful in our case in changing everything that has to do with opening up a business online is UNC12 laws, exemplar laws. So it's something related to that can be added into digital government. There are so many questions right now regarding, for example, artificial intelligence. How do we publish with algorithms, with use? How do we publish and how do we keep the balance of what algorithm decision making is based only on machine learning, when the government can intervene, how we make more transparent the use of personal data anonymization techniques. So all these things are so new that having some exemplar laws will add a lot of value.
Great, thank you. Vincenzo, did you want to comment at all? Okay, so so like you maybe, I've been taking some notes, and it seems like we have some themes running through the comments, right? So I'm going to just share what I think are some of the themes, and I'll give you some examples of what I think we're hearing, right? So there's a number of comments that talk about design principles, right? So Boyega talked about whatever you do, make it sustainable. Felicity talked about continuity, right? So there are some process principles, right? So whatever happens, don't throw out the past in the interest of the future completely, right? Some of the past we can get rid of, but don't throw it all out, right? So there's some design principles, and there may be others, but I heard some of these kinds of things. I also heard people talking about new kinds of indicators. For example, key services, looking at the services, or maybe mapping the services to the SDGs and be a bit maybe more comprehensive in terms of assessing readiness for those specific services. I heard about, Elsa talked about evidence-based policymaking, which is a thing everybody wants, but we also have to pay attention to the data and how data management and data quality. So are there indicators potentially that speak to those issues if they aren't already? Leadership with respect to data. There was also the kind of common, looking for projects that are common to all, procurement, it was procurement as a possibility, and saying what is the suite of things that everybody's striving to do. But then Boyega talked about the idea that maybe what we should be asking people in the different countries to do is to say, here is what I would like to be assessed on. Here's what I'm actually committing to do as a government. Here's my policy framework. I have a coherent countrywide policy at all levels of government, and this is our agenda. So assess our readiness, assess our capability to do the things that we have, in fact, committed to doing. So these are the kinds of challenges, right, as we think about design principles and we're looking for a comparative framework. but we also know how critical it is to be looking at specific investments and specific priorities of countries. So I also heard things about, let me find my list again, linkages to new kinds of tools. So what's the next step? Okay, so we think about instruments like this, and the idea is, so that what? So that I know more about who I am relative to other countries, but does the story end there? How does this process get expanded to provide this kind of linkages, on-ramps to capacity building, to tools, to the kind of things that were talked about here already. So those are just a few of the ideas. Content challenges, regional networks as a mechanism, maybe a tool both for the afterwards and maybe even the before, in terms of thinking about how some of these ideas can become regionalized and integrated, but then also the after-action reports and the after-action assessments and strategizing. Even at the point, I think it was also Felicity that talked about the interoperability. What's happening within regions, how are people sort of tooling up, if you will, to share data, to share frameworks, to share ideas. These make sense very often at the regional level, but not always at the global level. So what are the sharing models look like, and how can those ideas be integrated into the pre and the post kind of agenda setting for Vincenzo and his team? So given that it is 3 o'clock, and I have to go next door and present a paper. So yes, of course, absolutely. So I was going to say we can probably go for maybe 5 minutes. Is that okay? We have one comment here. Vincenzo wants to speak. Jane. So what may end up happening is if we go too long, I'll just leave. You guys can keep going. So Vincenzo, and then
I was going just to close because for the time, but I see that.
Okay. Okay. So there's here, and then Jane, and then.
Thank you. Maybe I'm the one who is actually very happy. Okay. Maybe I'm the one who actually very happy with the current survey. But I agree with Felicity. Maybe we have to get out of the data more with studies and future research. If any one of you work with EGDI data, you can feel that working with IMF data it takes you 5 minutes. With World Bank data it takes you 5 minutes. With EGDI, just to drop it, just to download it, it takes 1 hour. Why? Because the list of country is different to the country listed in World Bank data and IMF. You take a lot of time. There is no country code. There is no way to merge the data with add any other data. So that's a little thing that maybe can be improved in the visualization. And extracting the data year by year is really cumbersome with EGDI data. With World Bank data, 5 minutes, 20 years, 25 years. With EGDI, you have to click 1 year by 1 year by 1 year, and then you have to screen country by country, which is often different with the IMF data or even with World Bank data. So that little thing that can speed up the process and help us researchers to use data in greater way. Thank you.
Jane.
Yeah. So one point which could be added to the survey is that which nations are really using the EGDI data to take actions. So that will be one of the useful thing to know that okay, if there are 190 countries, how many are really using that and making their action plan to make sure that the next year's EGDI is going to improve for them. So a yes or no could be just useful.
Jane?
Thanks. The self-reporting toolkit, be happy to talk to you about how we can do that. We've got something underway, we might as well make it a useful one. So that would clearly be a collaborative process. But as I was the one that was reacting to all of the ministers who want to know how to lift their rankings, I think we can make a good job. In terms of the World Bank data, I don't know what your concerns are, but please tell me, because it looks like we're going to be asked onto the internal data council, so that would be probably a good starting point.
just a couple of observations. One is that, I don't know if you noticed, by the start of the session to now we move from talking about benchmarking and to measurement and assessment. There are three different things. So one of the big value of the benchmarking is the one that you have this, I mean, with all the limitation, but what do you say, distill the reality in one number that is manageable in a manageable form for policy consumption. That has its limitation, but is exactly what you were saying, that then you can use them for political action. And that has a value. Then for measurement and evaluation is a different story, and then you embark on a different journey. In that sense, if you move into trying to look and understand the problems on the demand side, it means you have to ask people if they are happy with the government services. And the problem we have, for instance, also in the EU benchmarking, is then if the person is not online, it doesn't exist, because you don't survey the people that are not using e-government services, and this is something that is a big limitation. So then it means you should also try to go in that direction, but this you cannot use, let's say, automatic tools, but this is an important issue to consider.
Okay, we're backing up against the next session, so Vincenzo is going to give closing remarks. I'm sorry if you wanted to contribute, we can do so over coffee.
Yes, I want just to really thank all of you for making this session. So it was a really big challenge for us. We say, let's see if it works. It works very, very well. So I really want to thank you, and I would like to ask a round of applause for all of you and for the moderator that did a great job. Thank you so much.
There have been a number of mechanisms excuse me, that have been used by the UNDESA team to convene working groups and have conversations in lots of different places. But it seemed logical to continue that opportunity here, to expand that opportunity to the ICEGOV community as well. Lots of people in the room are both affected by and study the index and have, I'm sure, lots to say about it. So as you have seen, we should introduce ourselves. My name is Teresa Pardo. Vincenzo, do you want to? Well, everyone knows Vincenzo. So our goal here today is to, let me just put this up, is to engage this community in a conversation. Absolutely a moderated discussion, no presentations unless they're suggested by you. So it's the third part in a three-part set of activities for this purpose. So a number of you, as requested, touch base with us in different ways. Email, we had conversations at dinner, during the break, saying, putting your hand up and saying, I'd like to speak. So we have a number of people, and I'll get back to how we're going to organize that in a second. We do want to ask you to be mindful of kind of the rules of a moderated discussion, right? So I'm the moderator. Vincenzo is here, and his role will be to listen, to respond when you ask him to, but mostly to kind of help us advance the conversation in ways that would be most useful in the next generation framework design. So mindful of the time limit and the timekeeper, and I think I'm going to be the timekeeper. Be open to comments and questions about your contributions. I would ask you, if you're going to ask questions of each other, please make them clarifying questions, not challenging questions so much, right? So this is an opportunity to engage in some debate, but gracious and clarifying and advancing the ideas as much as possible. Chatham House rules, what we hear here, well, it kind of doesn't stay here because we are going to write a report, but we will have a non-attribution report. We are recording, but only for the purposes of note-taking. We are not live streaming this conversation. We thought that that would be most appropriate, get people open and comfortable with the opportunity to make their comments. Any questions about the process we're going to follow? No, okay, because we're good, because we're kind of making it up as we go. Questions, you saw the questions yesterday. There are 5 of them. And I have a list of 4 people who have expressed interest in speaking, but I know there are more. So if you could raise your hand if you have, if you would like to get some airtime in this conversation over the next 55 minutes. And can you just tell me your name? I forget it. I knew it yesterday.
Irvin Holman.
Irvin?
Holman.
Okay. Who else? Gianluca, have you? Elsa? Yes. Tell me your name again. Felicity. Okay. So how much time we give each person is a function of how many people want to speak. So that's why I want to make sure that we have the names, as much of the names listed as possible. Okay, so that's about 7 people. So you get a few minutes less than a full paper session. But what we'd like to do is have you speak, as you know, for 3-4 minutes, share your ideas, and then we want to have a discussion about each of the contributions to the extent that it makes sense, and then move on. Let me ask this question. Who wants to respond or say anything about question 1? Elsa? Question 2? Elsa? Question 2? Okay, and you're, that's right, Ajay. Okay, question 2? Question 3? Question 3? Okay. So we're creating ad hoc structure here. Question 4? Perfect. Morton? Okay. Number 5, question 5. Elsa, Morton. Oh, excuse me. 4, 5, 5. Anybody else? And of course, if you want to jump in at the end, you can be part of the conversation on any question. If you want to make a new contribution, just I think we'll develop a mechanism for doing that as the conversation evolves. Okay? Vincenzo, anything to add?
Just one thing, in case you want also to contribute with a different question that is related to the others, then you also are welcome. And really, we are here to listen to you. And let's see now how it's going on.
Okay. 2 other points of process. We have a microphone here. So keep in mind that you are, and I'll try to get my daughter to stop texting me. Keep in mind that you're talking to each other, not us. So when you get the microphone, I'd like you to take the microphone, stand over here, and talk to the group, not just to me and Vincenzo, okay? So talk to each other. It's a conversation we want to have. Anything else? We'll figure it out as we go. Okay, so let's start with question 1. Elsa.
Thank you, Teresa. I just wrote some bullet points. I think I would like to follow on.
I'll just read the question?
Yes, please.
Right, it's up here. So if the survey is to be relevant, how must it be changed to reflect the use of emerging and driving technologies and their impact of e-government agendas?
So I would like to follow up on Ben's, the representative from IDB question on the panel yesterday. And I think that there is a need to make a trade-off between the stability and the change to be introduced in the framework. So I believe it will be better to introduce gradual changes, starting from perhaps adding some tools, documenting best or good practices in the use of such technologies to improve the delivery of public services. So for instance, we can start documenting how innovative technologies, like those that we were talking during these days, are used to proactively deliver innovative services that are personalized, that are context aware, that are context intelligent, thinking in terms of the user's needs. I also believe that we can document practices about how such technologies are used to deliver services driven by the citizens' needs. So how can we use text mining, artificial intelligence to understand what are the needs of the citizens to proactively deliver services for them. And also how such technologies can be used to simplify government-citizens interactions. So in order to eliminate procedures that are unnecessary, like we were talking today during the IDB session and Latin America and Caribbean session, to eliminate existing services like the birth certificate, that there is no need if interoperability is provided between government agencies. And well, as I mentioned before, to assess and understand citizens' needs. But I would like to comment something else, that for me, there is already a big challenge in e-government development between the different capacities of countries. So during all these years we were talking about the digital divide, and we were talking about the haves and the have-not in citizens. But I believe that introducing all this technology that is a must, because we cannot go back, will provide a different type of divide that is powerful and powerless governments to protect citizens. And this is a very big risk for me. Thank you.
Great. Any comments or questions for Elsa? Great. So 2 key points. 2 key points I heard is kind of gradual changes, user-focused. One of my favorites is problems is the digital divide among countries, kind of thinking about those differences, simplifying government citizen interaction. So those are some high points. The rest is on there. Okay. Vincenzo, any comments?
Yeah, I think all these points are really very well taken, and I was thinking just that we should also, this is also for you to think more, how we can really pilot some initiatives in order really to test if it is possible, then we can scale up. And really my dream is to have some engaging more people that work on artificial intelligence, also to do some assessment that can be done directly through machines, and then try to see how we can really look at also this difference among because the big challenges of the survey is that we cover all member states, but as you said, there are so big differences among all the states. So I think new tools can help us also to do this.
Yeah, go ahead. Where's the microphone? Oh, right here. Yes.
So I believe that from the academia point of view, here is our role, because, for instance, from the academic perspectives, we have strong departments in artificial intelligence that we can help you documenting case studies and using as white papers of how governments can use this type of technologies, yes.
Great, thank you. So the second, did you want to comment?
Yeah.
Okay, Gaston? Just again, remember, keep your comments short. We want to get 7 people to 5 questions.
It's about the formulation of the first question. What I have some doubt is the word must. How must? It's not mandatory to use emerging technology. I think that the driving force is to solve problem. If you solve problem with traditional technology, it's okay. It's not necessary to use. Should you use the driving technology, all of this fashion name like artificial intelligence? If you solve the problem with the traditional, it's okay. That's my point, is in order to produce some controversy.
So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay. Thank you. Ajay, let's go ahead. We're going to move to question number 2. Question number 2. Should, and if so, how, can the survey capture the use of digital technology by governments to support the global policy goals expressed in the SDGs?
Thank you. I'll be slightly deviating from the first one. I have 2 points. One will be deviation from the question, but one is again...
That's okay. It's your 3 minutes.
Yeah, fine.
Use it as you choose.
Okay. I'm Ajay Adal. I'm from India. I'm more into I was more into implementation aspect, so I'm never into policies. I'm not a researcher. I'm actually on the ground implementer. I have two points which I need to raise to UN government rankings, which are widely used by governments as a big impact. Number 1 is, can the UN government rankings consider the governments having legislations which will support the e-government practices? For example, they do not touch the core act. Can they have a sub-legislation, for example, Procurement Act? Can it have a sub-legislations which will facilitate e-procurement? For example, the State Treasury Act, can it be amended to facilitate the online treasury systems? So can the e-government rankings also assess the readiness of the member states to have such sub-legislations which can facilitate implementation of e-governance projects. That's one. Second is a link to SDGs. There are some e-governance projects which cut across all the countries. Same e-governance projects which are common to all countries. For example, online treasury, which is common to all countries. E-procurement, common to all countries. Citizen services, common to all countries. Though they are defined different, though they are named differently in different countries, but then these projects are common to all countries. Why can't a UN government survey assess these 3 or 4 projects which are common to all countries and then develop a separate index which will give how ready, how are the member states with these projects, at least the most common projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Comments or questions on this particular, right?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yolanda Martinez from Mexico, National Digital Strategy Office. I think question 2 is very relevant, and I think it will be very useful within the survey and on all the relevant tools around the survey if we can agree, and it's very related to what our colleague said, what are the key services for each of the Sustainable Development Goals that are most relevant to accomplish that goal. And usually those services that are common within countries, getting your birth certificate, getting a driver license, getting a license to open and up a business, a construction permit, like World Bank assessment on competitiveness. If we identify 2 to 3 services by each of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we measure in more in-depth indicators for those common services, it will provide a lot of insight on government, on, for example, time to respond, on interoperability standards that you use. And I think that's the biggest challenge within the 193 member countries, how we standardize the most common services. Digital identity should be a global standard since we are in a digital world. So I think the survey is a great tool in providing guidance when government come into place and are defining the government digital government strategy. So I think by having a very clear understanding of what are the most related services to each of the Sustainable Development Goals, what are the standards that allow these major services to be provided 100% online, and what other countries are doing in digitizing those services will add a lot of value. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to move on to question number 2. And Elsa, if you want to combine
Yes,
combine your response, because you also wanted to speak to number 2.
Okay.
Yeah, so combine both responses.
I need to stand up.
If you wouldn't, well, you don't. You have a circle.
Don't worry. I will follow your instruction.
So, and you would never do this, but here's a technique I use when I'm moderating a group.
Okay, no problem.
Spatial relationships matter. So the closer I get, the less time you have to finish talking.
Oh,
So
I see.
And then as you start to talk, if I get close, wrap it up.
So just to add something to what Yolanda was saying, if we are focusing on services, then the orientation of the survey should change, because so far we are focusing on ministries on the supply side. So then we need to focus on the what they are the deliverables, yes? But also it would be very important to focus on the impact of these deliveries. So if we are focusing on these main services, how through these services we are reducing the time, we are reducing cost, the real impact of such services, yes? But in terms of money, benefiting for the citizens, say, facilitating his experience, but also in terms of environment. Yeah?
Great, thank you.
The second point.
Just to, also while you're talking, Gianluca is going to tee up a slide he wants to share, so pretend he's not here.
So the second point, I think data is the key here, and talking about data for informing policy, so evidence policy making is key in order to see how digital government can support the achievement of all SDGs. And in order to have this data and to ensure the quality of this data, I think there is a strong need for assessing the capacity of government institutions to ensure the quality of such data. And I think that again, the differences in countries, and when we were talking about, for instance, one of the indicators that is measured today, that is the GCIO function, still countries didn't deliver this. So assessing their capacity, because they don't have strong IT leadership, they don't have human capacity. So in order to ensure that they have data to facilitate policy-driven or evidence-based policy making, it will be very hard for them. So somehow we need to focus on the capacity.
Great. I'll take that. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and say, Elsa, what about CDOs?
Oh yes,
CD
it's another role that we need to ensure that government agencies
have the data.
You know?
This was something that because all these questions are somehow related, yes, and I think I was keeping this for the question number 5, and this is something that we need to strengthen the report, yes, with other kind of tools. And for instance, we can already see that in developed countries, many universities are already establishing executive programs or postgraduate programs on data analytics and data science, and still in developing countries we are not talking about these issues. So this is another topic to prepare this human capital for being able to deliver the function.
Right. Exactly. Are you ready, Gianluca, or should I go ahead? You ready? Okay. So that'll eventually go to Irvin, if you can grab there. So I chair our university's Advanced Data Analytics Steering Committee, and one of the most important topic conversations we have is what are we talking about, right? But at least we're convening, we're trying to figure out who's teaching what's wrong with what people are teaching, how do we get people teaching in a way that seems to be reflective of the best practices of this kind of work. But at least the conversations are happening, but we're not nearly as far along as we really need to be as well. So, Gianluca, and then you're to them. So 3 minutes, just because you have a slide doesn't mean we get more time.
No, just try to feel what. Well, anyway, just since I'm here, nobody yesterday talked about the experience of the European Union in this. We also have been going through this problem, let's say, of benchmarking. Now, this is not because I want to share with you, and then I will share with you 3 papers I've been co-authoring on these topics, criticizing from within both of the UNDESA and the European Commission benchmarking of e-government. And of course, I'm not going to present the papers. And also, maybe later, if you have time, there is an interactive digital agenda scoreboard that the European Commission developed also around the DESI index, the Digital Economy and Society Index, with all the indicators that you can compile and compare, etc. I'm sure UNDESA has also something like that, but this is for for the EU. Now, what I wanted to show you is going back a few years ago when I was in free. I could go out of the cage of the Commission. I was a sort of sabbatical, and I was in Tanzania, helping them trying to understand how to measure e-government. And of course, the first thing, as we all know, but just to remember, e-government maturity models and stage models are useful, but they are not the reality. And there are, I think Morten said there are about 40 now that have been developed, so it's very good, but they do not necessarily reflect how things go in real. But still, they are useful when we want to compare things. And the EU started with a 4-stage approach back in 2001, and then added one in 2007 that, of course, made created some problems, according to what was mentioned yesterday, in terms of how then you compare from a longitudinal point of view, but it was trying to reflect the changes in reality. Now, and this you can find information about this, I don't want to go into detail, but the main, let's say, critique to both the UN and the EU benchmarking from the academic has been the fact that they were, of course, reflecting only the supply side. In the case of the EU, we've been focusing on 20 basics services, and this was also one of the strengths, because you can then compare these very easily across the years. But then we ended up in a kind of, let's say, paradox, as we were all trying to be on the top of this digital race that was more virtual than real. But it was very useful to help the government to focus on specific aspects of e-government. And of course, also it gave this blame and shame effect. But we all have to be consider that this is not enough. Then when we go local, we need to move from benchmarking to bench learning. I'm sure you all have been discussing about this. But then what is important in this case, also in the EU, there's been the discussion, okay, shall we move forward? How can we look at the demand side? And the methodology has been changed in 2012, looking at live events, embedding several services in this live event approach. 3 was to start with. And they were, of course, this included, as resources are not so high as it can be imagined, to reduce the number of websites scanned, but focusing then through mystery shopping on these specific services. And I don't go into details. And to conclude,
perfect timing.
I just get to these nice images of the report, because then when you have the data set, you can do a lot of stuff. What is the value of benchmarking? My suggestion is not to discard, abandon, because this is, was, at least in the EU, very useful to stimulate mutual learning, control what they are doing or not doing, and try to have convergence. Because remember, e-government is not competence of the European Union, it's member states' competence. So we can just suggest, support, etc., as you in the UN as well. And so the last point is that despite there are many limitations, there is a rich data source that can be considered. But going back to your first question, maybe you can use more of the new technologies to look at the demand side rather than the supply side. So.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Really, I don't want to take too much time, but
that's right, because I'll get close.
The feedback received from you are very, very important, very interesting. First of all, about the issue raised and the point raised by the colleague from India. The issue of legislation is really important. We try also to this time for the first time. We have done a very comprehensive questionnaire that we have submitted to member states, and there is one section that is about rules and regulation legislation. So we also got information directly from the government from that part. I'm also happy to say that we received more than 100 back. If you consider that it is 193, 100 is a big result. In the past, we received not more than 30%. The new indexes, there is an issue of capacities. We don't have so much capacity. They are already cutting budget and person. So also the reason for this kind of meeting is also to think a little bit out of the box and try to create a community, multi-stakeholder community that can really also help us. So stepping on the last point, with the group that's working also on the benchmarking for European Commission, we are also collaborating with them. We have introduced some issues, also what Yolanda said about identify some services, mystery shopping. We did something similar for 2018. But my dream, really, I repeat here, is that the idea is that because at the end we should have, as you said, e-government, digital government, this is belong to member states. We can just give some guidelines, identify some principles, try to push them to follow that, but then they have the responsibility. But if we are able to provide some toolkit that can be easily downloaded by member state, for example, looking at and using a way to assess not some indicators that can be assessed automatically through the toolkit that we design together. So we need also someone that can in-kind contribution support us to develop that and then make it available to the community. Then we can rely on the results that come from, because it's a sort of certified indicators that we can use for that. So just I put the ball in your field. It's your, sorry.
No, it's okay. That's right. I thought you wanted to hand me the mic. I'll take it. Yeah, we'll leave it there. Okay, so just, we're at the halfway point. Irvin is in the queue. Morton wants to respond. Is there anybody else who would like to get their name added to the list to speak to the question? So do you want to respond to this? Boyega? You want to? Okay, okay. So,
less than 3 minutes.
Okay, your time didn't start yet. Boyega, do you want to get added to the queue, or do you want to respond to something here? Okay, can you, oh, sorry, Morton was first.
It was just a quick response. I'd actually put that under 4 and 5 about data and methodology.
Yeah.
It's already been mentioned that the main critique of all these benchmarks that they're supply and technology focused. Yeah. So I think it's risky to start chasing new technology. In principle, we look at a service outcome and we don't care what the technology is made of. In terms of measuring the services used, platforms like the performance platform at GDS, which has also been used for the Danish strategic approach between 2012 and 17, to look at channel mix and the use of that and moving citizens between, is very easy to do and can be aggregated down to local level. The challenge is that most authorities don't know how much service requests they have globally, on what channel, and at what time, which responds to capacities. So there are already elements for the service delivery angle existing that can be used for this, and there is national and local experiences on that. But it's been proposed since 2010 by the Brits and the Danes to the Commission, but the response from other authorities is, oh, it's too difficult. But it proves back to bad management. If you don't know how many services you have and when, how can you deliver good service?
Right, okay, Boyega. Thank you, Warren.
And this for Vincenzo directly, and of course other people can respond to it as well. So there are 3 points. Very short. There are 3 points, and we don't even have to respond to it, just for people to think about it.
To have it on the
record. Okay. The first is about how to really make these member states owners of this measurement. So you said it's for them, but frankly, when you look at the process, they don't own it. And a very good alternative is to look at what is maybe happening in the OGP process. I think that's something that could be really studied, where government and civil society actually are made to own that process of their measurement itself. And that leads to the second point, where you can actually have a measurement, the possibility of having a measurement where countries actually declare what commitments they would like to have regarding areas of improvement based on their needs. So that when we're comparing, so it's not a matter of comparing India to Estonia, because they have different needs and they may want to improve in different areas. But we're still able to measure them globally, comparatively, based on what they declare. So that's the second point. The third is the notion of what some people call the skeptic's guide. How do you really want to convince the community or the government, the policymakers, that what you actually invest in actually works? All right, so these are frameworks that we see others using, and the question is, how feasible is this within the context of this?
Perfect, perfect. And we have one more. You wanted to comment on this last discussion? Or do you have a new point? Okay, go ahead, and then you're up. Nobody else. Do you have the mic still? Yes. Yes, perfect.
Vincenzo, if I understand correctly, you were mentioning last time that in the next release, you will launch the survey to member states to self-report their performance. Is that what you were saying? You mentioned that you will launch another survey, like that countries will self-report.
No. I have not said that.
All right, then I will cancel the motion.
It is my dream.
That's a dream.
Keep dreaming.
Okay. All right. So we have 234. We are on question number 3. Still, I think we had one contribution here. I won't read it because it's long. Just go right ahead.
I want to get close to you. Following Luca's presentation, I don't know how this is going to go, but in one sense, we can provide assistance in the region. As you know, we have a network, and maybe at the region and sub-region level, if we have some common standards, it would be less of an effort for us to gather information for different types of organizations, so that we can collaborate on that. In terms of on this question. Interesting for governments, when you're surveying, to gather some information, some that you could publish, some you could monitor, and see how they can make sense of the story as this evolved. An example of that will be useful for governments is to be able to compare budget issues, how much of GDP or per capita, different ways of analyzing the information and correlating data, as similar is done with education and other areas of how effective we can be in e-government. And in terms of investment, well, the breakdown of ICT, online services, etc., and even we can start measuring how much you're doing legacy versus innovative platforms, as has been mentioned here. The other thing is, as we evolve, I think we have to start measuring not only that we provide a service, but how much that service is adopted, how much is on-premise or how much is online service, so we can start comparing how the platforms are being adopted by the population, not just the infrastructure and the availability, but how it is used.
Great, thank you. Wow, you cede a moment to the floor. Would anyone like to use everyone's last minute? Any comments?
Just to add to that, in the what we call MSQ, that member state questionnaire, the one that we have submitted, also there are some questions related to the budget, how much they invest in terms also research and development, and the percentage of the budget allocated for ICT versus the other budget, and also looking at the GDP. So definitely that is also very important information that we need to collect, otherwise it's also very difficult to understand. And this is also related to the priorities of the countries, because in some countries, especially for example in Africa, some budget is still concentrating on what is really important for them, because they don't have electricity, they don't have water, so they cannot really afford to look at some other area. Not all the countries, of course, and not all the cities, but this is important also to look at the priorities. But within this is also part also for you to think more. For us, what is important is that we have reorganized the survey looking at the SDGs. So really that is the framework that will lead us till 2030. Then we'll see what happens in the future. So that part is really, really important, looking at the principles and what are the priorities under that agenda.
Yes, go ahead. I hate to have something like that.
One question, Vincenzo. When you ask about IT budget, is divided into current expenditures and capital investments, because most of the governments, they do have perhaps an IT budget and they justify this, but there is the proportion of this budget dedicated to capital investment in IT is minimum, and this is key also, yes?
We had more than 65 questions, I don't remember now exactly, but this question is available, it's already online, and it's not, so it's easy to check on that. And in any case, that was the first, we can improve and we can continue the dialogue with member states.
Great. Felicity? We have, just so we know, we have about 22 minutes left. I think if we keep everybody moving, we can get everybody who has raised their hand to make a comment in and still have a few minutes for an open discussion. So Felicity, go ahead.
This is unattributable, yes?
Yes, unattributed.
Okay.
This is solely for the purposes of note-taking. So we moved on to question number 4. Just very briefly, what alternative data sources and data collection approaches might be considered for the next generation framework? Just speak to that.
Okay, a couple of my points have already been made in response to others. Firstly, I think we should automate as much as we can what we collect now, so that we can concentrate on new things without losing the historical comparison. And I think that regardless of whether the index starts to change or doesn't start to change straight away, we should at least provide for a number of years the historical comparison, so that we can show whether or not there's a change as the index changes. I absolutely think we should leverage the index to encourage governments to be more open about what they're doing. By which I mean, by publishing the rankings, by making public what we have as feedback, we should be getting governments to provide a clearer review themselves of what they provide. Setting out, these are the things that we're looking for in our National Readiness Index and in our Global Readiness Index. and see if we can't get each government to provide a similar web page which their citizens as well as the United Nations can access, showing what they're doing in terms of AI. Secondly, I really think we should start to welcome code sets into the index. When we're looking in terms of automation and machine learning, we've got open code repositories like GitHub now have a government section, and we should absolutely be looking to see how much governments are actually putting out there, whether to share or not to share, because that's a great way of us seeing what they're automating. And thirdly, would it be possible for us to add to the index, if not of national readiness, then a global readiness index, a measure of how well countries are sharing their methods and their data with each other? I mean, things like, you know, do they have a set of base standards that make them able to interoperate? Do they have common services that they can start to work together with? And even in countries maybe that are developing their maturity in services or that don't have the money, countries that get together in similar geopolitical regions and create services that are alike for all of them between them, that should count towards their ability to share and function, and that should push them higher up the index. I'm done.
Comments, questions? Okay. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I take this point in sharing of the platforms between two countries or two states. What happens is e-governance implementations are usually done on a public-private partnerships, where the source code and the IP lies with the vendor. So in case we want to share the platform with other states, the state is unable to share because they don't have the IPR and the source code. So this is one of the constraints, and of course government doesn't have the capacity within to develop the solutions by themselves. This is one serious constraint which we have observed, where we can't share the platform with the other states or other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Felicity.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right, and I would say that makes you less ready than a country which is doing it in the open. So it's a good way of us ensuring that as countries mature in their digital service offering, they own the IP themselves and open it up in Creative Commons.
Elsa, and let's bring the microphone to you. I think you should stay right where you are. Can you bring the microphone to Elsa, please? What you should say? Just speak from there. We're on number 4. You said you wanted to speak to number 4.
Yes. Okay. So number 4, I think that here I would like to mention 2 data sources. Perhaps one is academia and research institutes. There are many researchers doing interesting things in biology, fishery, and so on, that they have interesting data, but this data is only private for them. And also the role of small data. So we are always talking about big data, but small data, data that is comprehensive, that could be actionable, is also very important.
Other comments? Morton, if you want to go ahead.
It's more of a response and support of Fleece's argument about the vendor login and lack of capacities. It highlights the other area you mentioned, procurement capacities, because you can do your procurement, so you don't have a login in code and you know, off-the-shelf proprietary software by ensuring that it's open source open code. There are lots of examples in Denmark and Sweden and also elsewhere in the world where local authorities are collaborating and ensuring that things are open source so other municipalities can use it. And that's sort of the idea that Fleece is highlighting as I hear it, that also countries in regions can do this.
So this is part of the support, if you will, for the notion of assessing the interoperability, the shareability, the openness to collaboration.
And you see that emerging in different networks. The Latin American session highlighted that, for instance.
Great. Boyega, you want to jump in on this?
Just to say, regarding 4, that whatever new sort of data sets that's considered, I think we have to look to the past at what has happened. So initially, I think about 10 years ago, the DESA's framework was not the only one available. We were looking at about 5 or 6 at any point in time. Accenture was particularly very popular with government leadership. But what happened? I think they just died off. And I don't know, I've not seen any study on why they died off, but I think it's going to be about sustainability of that approach. which was very rich, which was really very rich, and was a darling for all the key policymakers because it was really case-based and it provided a lot of learning. But the problem there is the sustainability and the cost of producing those things. And so, whatever we say regarding 4, I would say think hard about sustainability, aspect of it. Are you really able? How much will it cost to be able to gather this information and do it in a sustainable way? Yeah.
Yes, please do.
And here is something that is related to what she said about collaboration and partnership. Yes, this is something that we need to build in terms of what is existing and how we share the data that is already existing.
So I haven't heard anything in this conversation unless I missed it. Gianluca, let me just ask my question, then we'll get back to you, about data collection, right? The process of data collection, right? So we know how it gets collected now in most cases, but are there other ideas for how, some of what's been talked about has been, would require different kinds of data collection than what we're used to doing in the readiness survey. So who was going to go ahead? Yolanda, we'll go back to Felicity. Oh no, Gianluca, sorry, you were first, then Yolanda, then Felicity.
Just again, building on what Morten said before, that as a note of caution on, having dreams that can be actually implemented and avoid to lose what is already valuable that has been done so far. There's the issue of the economics of e-government, and the Commission tried, but of course member states stopped, didn't want to go into didn't want anyone to go, especially the Commission, into their kitchen. And because if you want data for economic, to show the economic impact of e-government, you need to have data on the cost and you have standardized approaches that at the moment are not necessarily available. And there was a very interesting project with a model, an economic model behind it, the e-government economics project, that was very pioneer 15 years ago almost, but member states stopped they didn't want to go into that. But maybe you can be more ambitious than the European Union and find that this approach, use this approach in your countries. But let's be realistic, because sometimes entering into the back office is not so easy. And that links to the data collection, because this is not something that you can really automatize. You need to have the data from the official sources when it comes to, and also you need to have a conceptual framework, because it's not just having the data, but then how this data link to the causality.